The door closed behind me the way a verdict sounds when no one asked for your side of the story. I was 22 years old, and I had just become a wife in the only way our community understood that word. The house smelled of fresh-cut pine and a stranger's soap, and both of those things belonged to me now. Eli had built the bed himself, and every man at the supper table had made sure I knew it, clapping his shoulder like the wood proved something permanent about his character. I stood in my nightdress with my hands folded the way I had folded them since I was small enough to be corrected for not doing so. My shoes sat beside his boots near the door, smaller and newer, 2 pairs arranged like an illustration of what a marriage was supposed to look like. I remember noticing that. I remember thinking how strange it is that a room can hold 2 people and still feel entirely empty of air. Earlier there had been singing, and the singing had made it feel real in a way the ceremony alone had not. Long wooden benches, low German hymns rising slow and certain toward the rafters, women pressing my hands between both of theirs and calling me a bride with tears already forming at the corners of their eyes. My mother had held my face in her palms the way she used to when I was feverish and needed steadying, and she told me God was good. I believed her without question, the way I believed everything she handed me. The warmth of all those bodies, all that collective certainty, was still sitting on my skin when the latch fell. And then it was gone, the way heat abandons a fieldstone once the sun drops behind the tree line, all at once and without ceremony. I had walked into that house believing I was crossing a threshold into something open. I did not yet understand that a threshold can face either direction. Eli did not come to me. I had prepared myself for that, for the closeness of a man I barely knew outside of church benches, and one shared meal. My mother had given me almost nothing to carry into that night, only the instruction that a good wife submits and does not ask, and I had accepted that the way I accepted everything handed down from above eye level. So I stood ready to give whatever a wife was expected to give, and instead he stayed at the wall, one palm pressed flat against the boards, as though the house itself needed his weight to remain standing. His shoulders were drawn up high and rigid around his ears. I had never seen a man hold himself that way, except when something was about to go badly wrong. A man does not stand like that on the night he has been waiting for. A man stands like that when the waiting has become something he is no longer certain he can survive. There was a window on the far wall. A plain, dark shade covered it completely, pulled all the way to the sill, and my eyes kept returning to it the way your tongue finds a sore tooth without your permission. The lamp Eli had set on the sill threw a soft yellow square of light onto that shade, and the square shifted and trembled each time the flame moved in some invisible current of air. I could not have told you why it held my attention the way it did, why I looked at it more often than I looked at my new husband standing 6 feet away. Some part of me, the part that operates below the level of thought, may have already understood that the room had a wall I was not supposed to look through. Or maybe I only tell myself that now, after 6 years of turning that night over and over until I know every surface of it. When Eli finally spoke, he did not use my name. He said there was something I had to promise him, and his voice was low and deliberate, each word placed down carefully, the way you set something fragile on an uneven surface. He started and stopped twice before anything came out that carried meaning, his mouth opening and then closing again around whatever he was trying to release. I have watched men in our community lie to an elder's face without blinking, and none of them had as much trouble as Eli had that night, saying one plain thing to the woman he had just married. The longer the silence stretched, the more certain I became that whatever came next was going to leave a mark on me. I had the wrong idea about the shape of it, though. I thought the difficult words between a man and a woman on their wedding night would be about the body, about duty, about the parts of myself I had been taught to carry with shame and silence. That is what a lifetime of preparation had made me expect. I stood there bracing for a demand I did not want, my hands cold, my heartbeat loud enough to embarrass me, ready to bow my head and say yes to something I had no language to refuse. That is what obedience had made of me by 22. But it was not that. It was never about that at all. He turned just enough that the lamplight caught the side of his face, and I saw something wet at the outer corner of his eye, and then he told me the rule. I must not lift that shade until the sun was fully up, not part way, not nearly, fully up. He said that phrase twice, until the sun is fully up, as though daylight were a specific and necessary medicine, as though the morning itself were going to save us both from whatever this night contained. I nodded. I had been nodding at men my entire life, and my body knew how to do it before my mind had finished deciding. He looked at the covered window when he said the last part, not at me, and he said I must not lift that shade no matter what I heard outside. Then he blew out the lamp before I could form a single question, so that his rule was the last thing left standing in the room. There was only dark after that, and the smell of pine, and two people breathing in a space that did not yet belong to either of them. No matter what I heard, not saw, heard, that one small word settled into the floor of my stomach like something dropped into still water. I lay down in the black beside a stranger, and I began, without fully realizing I was doing it, to listen. Eli's breathing slowed and deepened long before mine did, and he slept turned away from me, with one arm thrown over his ear, as though even in sleep he had decided not to receive whatever was coming. I lay on my back with the quilt at my chin and my eyes wide open, learning the shapes of a ceiling I would be expected to call mine. I want you to understand what kind of woman I was in that room, so you will know why I held still as long as I did. I was raised to keep rules the way other children are raised to breathe, without examining the mechanism, without questioning the need. When I was small, I asked my father once why the women ate after the men, and he did not raise his hand to me. He only looked at me with a tired disappointment that settled heavier than any strike could have, and my mother drew me from the room by the wrist, and the lesson required no further instruction. A good girl does not ask why. A good girl assumes the why is holy, even when it sits on the back of her neck like a hand pressing down. So I lay there obedient, telling myself the shade was nothing, the rule was nothing, the dark was only a farm at night doing what farms do. The first sound came, and I almost believed myself. It was a gate, I decided, the pasture gate, catching the wind the way it does when the air leans on it after midnight. I let out a breath I had not known I was holding, and I even smiled a little at the smallness of my own fear. A bride, I thought, jumping at gates and shadows on her wedding night, which is exactly the kind of woman I had been trained to be. I told myself all the reasonable things in my mother's voice, the calm and closing voice she used when a subject was finished. A farm is never truly silent. There are animals shifting weight, timbers settling, the small private conversations a house has with itself after dark. I was so certain. I had almost fully convinced myself. And then the second sound arrived, and it did not let me stay certain for even one more breath. Footsteps. Not the wandering drift of an animal finding its way in the dark, but the slow and deliberate weight of a person moving with intention, moving along the side of the house, directly beneath the window I had been forbidden to open. My whole skin went tight. I lay rigid in the dark and counted the steps the way you count seconds between lightning and thunder. One footfall, then another, then a pause so complete it had weight and texture and intention behind it. The pause of a body that has stopped moving because it wants to hear what the house is doing in return. My skin understood before my mind did, the way skin always knows first, and every hair on my arm stood up in the same instant. I told myself a hired man, a neighbor, someone's dog that had learned to walk like a person in the dark. I told myself every reasonable thing a reasonable woman could construct out of silence and fear and 6 hours of marriage. The footsteps resumed, slower now, moving toward the corner of the house, where the window shade hung dark and sealed against the glass. They stopped directly beneath it, and the stopping was worse than the walking had been. Then the third sound arrived, and it was not the wind, and it was not an animal, and no story I could tell myself would make it into something safe. It was a voice, a woman's voice, low and careful in the yard below, shaped by the specific effort of someone who does not want to wake a sleeping house. I could not catch the words at first, only the cadence of them, the particular rise and fall that belongs to someone who is pleading and trying not to sound like they are pleading, the way a person speaks when they have already rehearsed every version of this conversation, and none of them ended well. I lay absolutely still and let the sound move through the window glass and through the dark of the room and into the center of my chest, where it sat like a coal. Then the voice shifted, clarified, the way a radio station comes clear when you stop moving and just hold the antenna steady. She said a name, one syllable, clean as a struck bell in a cold room, and the name was not mine. A woman's name I did not recognize, spoken by a woman I could not see, in the dark yard beneath the window my husband had sealed against me. My hand moved toward the shade before I had made any decision to move it, the body acting on its own, the way bodies do when the mind is still pretending not to understand. I caught it, pressed my palm flat beneath my own ribs, pinned it there the way you pin a letter you are not yet ready to send. The voice came again, closer now, just below the sill, and this time the name she said was his. Eli, spoken the way you say a word you have worn smooth from long use, a name that has lived in the mouth so many years it no longer requires any effort to release, soft and familiar and belonging to her in a way that had nothing to do with ceremony or community or a marriage arranged in rooms I was never invited into. Beside me, my husband stirred, his breath catching on something, breaking into a sound that was almost language. He answered her from the pillow, low and thick with sleep, a name that moved through the dark room like smoke, a name that had never once crossed his lips in the weeks of our courtship, a name that was not Miriam. Something in me that had spent 22 years keeping its hands folded quietly refused, all at once, to fold them any more. I turned back the quilt, and my feet found the floorboards, and the cold of them went straight up through my bones like a current. I moved the way you move in unfamiliar dark, one hand out ahead of me for furniture that was not where instinct expected it to be. My heart was making enough noise that I was certain it would reach him before my footsteps did, certain the sound of it would pull him up out of whatever dream held that other name. Behind me, Eli breathed on, deep and even, given over completely to a sleep that had nothing to do with peace and everything to do with a man who had set down a heavy thing and was resting in the relief of having set it down. Each step toward the window felt like stepping out of a version of myself I had been wearing so long I had mistaken it for skin. I had never in 22 years done a thing I had been plainly told not to do, not once, not in any way that mattered. And here I was crossing a dark room toward the one thing I had been most specifically forbidden. On the first night my husband had a right to forbid me anything. My knees shook the entire way, and I kept going anyway, and that was the beginning of something I did not yet have a name for. I reached the window and stood with my palm against the shade, feeling the stiff cheap cloth, and behind it the cold of the glass, and beyond the glass a faint gray that was not yet morning but was no longer fully night. The sky in that hour before dawn does not commit to anything, and I understood exactly how it felt. I told myself I would only lift a corner, just enough to prove to the part of me that was still a good girl that there was nothing out there but a neighbor and a gate, and my own bridle nerves making a story from ordinary sounds. My fingers found the bottom edge, and I stood there longer than I want to admit, the whole weight of 22 years of folded hands pressing down on those fingers, asking me to let go of the cloth and go back to bed. Then I lifted it 1 inch, and through that inch I saw a lantern sitting on the ground in the side yard, its light making a small warm circle on the frost-bitten grass, and at the edge of that circle a pair of bare feet, pale as milk against the dark ground. I lifted the shade another inch, slow, and the feet became legs, and the legs became a plain dark dress, and the dress became a woman standing very still, with her hands cupped low over the front of her body. The way a woman stands when she is carrying a child and has begun, without thinking about it, to hold it from the outside. My breath fogged the glass and I wiped it with my sleeve, and I could not stop looking now. Not if the house had caught fire around me, not if Eli had risen and taken me by the shoulder. I lifted the shade the rest of the way, and I saw her face. And she was young, younger than me, I thought, though sorrow can age a face or leave it strangely untouched, and hers had been left alone by it, in the way that is almost worse. She was looking up at my window with the directness of someone who has stood in this yard before and knows exactly which window it is and what it looks like from below at this hour. There was no rage in her face, and that was the thing that undid me completely, because rage I could have categorized, rage would have given me somewhere to stand. What she had instead was a grief so deep and so finished that it had gone entirely quiet, the grief of a person who has already spent every tear she had, and has come now only to witness a thing she could not prevent and cannot stop. I understood without a word exchanged between us that she was not a stranger to this house. She had a claim on it that preceded mine, a claim that had nothing to do with ceremony, and everything to do with what had happened before anyone thought to send for me. The bed creaked behind me, and Eli's voice came up out of sleep, thick and rising, saying my name in a way that told me he already knew. I heard him sit upright, and I heard the specific silence that follows when a person sees something they had arranged never to have seen. The sun was not yet up, and I had already broken his one rule, and the three of us held still in that moment the way figures in a painting hold still, Eli in the tangled quilt, the woman frozen in her circle of lantern light, and me pinned between them at the glass with the shade bunched in my fist. When I turned to look at him, I had braced for anger, for the particular wrath of a man whose rule has been broken, because that is what I had been raised to expect from a man in that position. But there was no wrath in his face at all, only terror, and the terror was not about me. I understood that quickly. He was afraid of what my knowing was going to cost, and not only him. He came to the window in his nightshirt, and he looked down at the woman in the yard, and something moved across his face that I had no name for then, and have only a hard name for now, and he said, "You were not supposed to see," his voice cracking on the last word, the way a boy's voice cracks, not "how dare you," not "obey me," only that the seeing itself was the thing that had gone wrong, as if the sin lived in my eyes and not in the arrangement. The truth did not arrive all at once. It reordered itself slowly, the way a room looks different once you understand the light is coming from a different direction than you thought. The rule had never been about my body or my obedience or any of the things I had spent the night bracing myself against. It was a clock. The shade was a clock, and the daylight was the hour at which the clock was supposed to have finished its work, because she was meant to be gone before I ever knew to look for her. There were hands in this that belonged to neither Eli nor me, older hands, the hands of men who had sat in rooms I was not permitted to enter, and decided that the cleanest solution to a problem was to marry the man quickly to a girl from another settlement, and move the problem out of the yard before morning. I was not a bride, I was a solution, and the wedding had been the instrument of the solving, and every warm hand pressed over mine the day before had been part of the covering. Eli asked me quietly to keep it, not to unsee it, he knew that was gone, but to hold it the way he held it, folded down inside myself, where it could not do what the truth does when it gets loose in a community that has built itself on the architecture of silence. He said for her sake and nodded toward the yard, and I believe he even meant it, because that is the particular mercy of a person who has been obeying for so long that they have confused obedience with goodness. The woman in the yard had heard us, and she did not wait to be sent for. She bent slow and careful and lifted her lantern, and before she turned, she looked up at me one last time and lifted one hand, palm open, held toward my window for the space of a single breath. Not a wave, something older than a wave, a greeting and a goodbye and an apology that had no language large enough to hold it, all in one open hand from one woman to another, across a yard made of frost and silence and the decisions of men. I pressed my own hand flat against the cold glass to meet it, and then she was gone into the dark between the barn and the road, and the lantern went with her, and the yard was only frost and the flattened grass where she had stood, and then the sun came up the way it always comes, without caring, a thin gold line along the far field that became the whole cold morning, bright and ordinary and merciless, showing me exactly what I had married. I turned from the window and I said to my husband plainly, I will not pretend I did not see her, my voice shaking on every word, and I said it anyway, and somewhere behind my ribs, for the first time in 22 years, my hands came unfolded. I stayed, and I want to be honest about that, because the stories we tell about leaving always skip the long middle, where a woman is still inside the thing, making breakfast, setting 2 plates, moving through the motions, while something new and permanently awake moves through her underneath. That is what breaking one rule does. It does not free you all at once. It only teaches your hands that they can come unfolded, and after that you cannot fully forget the feeling. And I carried the girl in the yard inside me like a coal I would not let go cold, and I looked for her, and if you have ever pressed your hand to cold glass, to meet the hand of a woman you were never supposed to see. I am asking you to tell me below, because I read everyone, and some of us were never given a room where we could say these things out loud, and this channel is that room, and you are welcome in it.